lieu of having Iyad say more about his own operational security, we're going to have a session talking about the digital authoritarian's toolbox. And I'd like to welcome to the stage Samantha Bradshaw, Brittan Heller, John Scott-Railton, and Rossalyn Warren.
Hey, Andy.
Hi, and welcome to this morning's talk. This morning, our session will be focusing on the tools and techniques employed by next-generation digital authoritarians. Some of the issues we'll be exploring are the goals of digital authoritarians, the ways in which they create domestic chaos, to other wider trends, the shutting down of avenues of information, and often in the name of combating hate speech, with a prime recent example being in Sudan. Some of the questions that we'll be exploring in our discussion today will be, how is the internet used to harass opponents and suppress dissenting voices? How is it used for the purpose of mass manipulation? And what steps might we take to reclaim the internet from these bad actors? We'll be hearing from each of our speakers here and then opening up to a wider Q&A. So, Brittan, would you like to start us off?
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Susie Sunshine. I'm here to tell you about how governments around the world are tightening control over citizens' data and using constraints on information to quell dissent. This is resulting in an erosion of trust, not only in the internet, but in the foundations of democracy. I'm going to tell you about 3 trends that I've noticed digital authoritarians using to try to intimidate people and silence critique. These are 1, direct intimidation of human rights defenders and minority voices. 2, quelling dissent in the name of stopping online harms. And 3, use of online harassment as a template and stomping ground of the digital authoritarian. So first, let's talk about the direct intimidation of activists, journalists, human rights defenders, and minorities. Take, for example, Project Galileo. Project Galileo is an effort by cybersecurity firm Cloudflare to provide basic cybersecurity protections for human rights defenders. It's been in existence for about 5 years, and it provides protection against DDoS attacks for people enrolled in the program. In preparation for their 5th anniversary, Cloudflare has been gathering statistics about the people enrolled in the program. And they found that every organization enrolled in Project Galileo has experienced attacks over the last month. 60% of the people enrolled in the program have experienced attacks every day. Think about that. Now, some people might say that this is based on the nature of the internet, where malign actors are going to try to find any vulnerability and exploit it. But the CEO of Cloudflare thinks that this is not the case. He thinks that human rights defenders are explicitly targeted because of the importance of the message that they send. Researchers in the human rights community have seen similar trends in being targeted. You can look at researchers from the Citizen Lab. They have found themselves at the receiving end of efforts by nation-state affiliated actors to try to silence the type of work that they do. This may imply that they're onto something. I've personally experienced attacks from white supremacist and white nationalist affiliated groups directly responding to the work that I've been doing using AI to study hate speech and disinformation online. Second is we've noticed digital authoritarians trying to shut down avenues of information and dissent. Often, this is done in the name of combating hate speech. In the past week alone, there have been internet shutdowns in Sudan, Ethiopia, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Venezuela, and Liberia. And countries around the world are noticing, so they're trying to use legislative efforts to secure information integrity. There are active campaigns in Europe, Asia, rumblings in North America, and Australia. Over the past year, we've seen 17 countries either propose or approve controls in the name of fighting fake news and disinformation. Now, don't misunderstand me. Smart legislation could make way in trying to stop the disinformation train. However, there's an inherent danger here. The same law, even the same text, cut and pasted from one regime to the next, will look very, very different based on the commitment to the rule of law and the human rights record of the country that is administering the statute. 3, I've noticed the use of malign activity like hate speech and disinformation to directly harass and target minority groups. Online harassment is the vocabulary of the digital authoritarian. The vectors of disinformation and misinformation are often intertwined with hate speech and online harassment. This is how offline phenomena are translated into online activity. Now, companies have been notoriously remiss in dealing with online harassment, and it's been this way for a long time. And what bad actors have done is they've recognized this is a fundamental vulnerability, both in the structure of these companies and in the policy apparatuses that have been set up around online harassment. So what do? They exploit the vulnerability. You can look at the work of the Institute for the Future, which targets how 10 separate minority groups have been the target of disinformation, if you want more details about this. You can also look to the Oxford Internet Institute that details out the connection between gender-based targeting and disinformation. The AI work that I've done has shown that hate speech in an online environment looks different than hate speech in a kinetic environment. Digital authoritarians are using hate speech to try to target all groups. With the D-Lab at UC Berkeley, I tried to study what xenophobic hate speech would look like online and the characteristics of how it moves through these environments. And what we found is that we actually couldn't separate it out. We couldn't disaggregate xenophobic hate speech from homophobic, racist, sexist, other religious-based discrimination, and anti-Semitism. So online authoritarians are being opportunistic in the way that they're targeting minority groups and not just specifically focusing in on populations. These are the 3 most disturbing trends that I've been seeing. And so the question for me is, why are digital authoritarians doing this? They're doing this to create domestic chaos and fear and to exacerbate pre-existing social fissures. They're doing this to silence voices and to deliberately target influencers. And finally, they're opportunistically leveraging or even warping the best efforts of individuals who care deeply about human rights and freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brittan, for providing a really great overview of the goals and the trends of digital authoritarianism. I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes or so focusing on the tools that authoritarian regimes might use to achieve these goals. When we think about information control in the digital age, we traditionally think about some of the more blunt tools around censorship, filtering content, shutting down access to information altogether. These have, been the bread and butter of authoritarian regimes' information control tools for quite some time. But increasingly, we're starting to see the rise of computational propaganda, which is a much more subtle way of controlling the flow of information. It's not about blocking or restricting access or stopping access altogether, but it's about influencing, it's about manipulating, it's about nudging people's behaviors, nudging their ideals, nudging their beliefs, very, very subtly. And I think there are three important ways that computational propaganda is new, right? Propaganda has existed for as long as people have been trying to influence one another. There's nothing new about it, but it's the social networking technologies, the social media platforms that create certain affordances that can enhance a lot of these propaganda campaigns, that can enhance the scale, the reach, and the precision of the messaging that goes behind disinformation and propaganda. And so the first thing that we talk about when we're looking at computational propaganda has to do with automation. And I'm sure throughout the sessions, we've talked a lot about bots and automation and how they can distort conversations online because they aren't human. So they can like, share, retweet, all kinds of content so much more effectively and so much more than any human actively could online. This ultimately serves to distort our entire information ecosystem. It can amplify support for a particular person, an ideal, a movement, and amplify it in ways where that support might not necessarily exist. We're seeing a lot of crude automation techniques appear around elections, especially in fragile democracies and new and emerging democracies. There's a lot of new bot activity appearing around elections in those countries. We're also seeing authoritarian regimes use these crude automated tools to try and influence other elections. So the US 2016 presidential election is the most obvious example, but we see it in all parts of the world during all kinds of important political events. The second new thing about computational propaganda has to do with the algorithms themselves and the way that the algorithms prioritize, organize, sort, recommend content to users. Right now, it's debatable as to whether or not algorithms are prioritizing truth over popularity. The platforms have made a number of tweaks to their algorithms to combat bad actors who are constantly trying to understand the inner workings of these complex technical systems in order to game them, to get their messages out there. Facebook recently announced changes to promote content that involves more meaningful engagement, for example. But whether or not these changes are enough or sufficient to address the broad challenge, and whether they're able to keep up with bad actors who are constantly experimenting with these algorithms to get their content into real people's news feeds, it's still really questionable. It's also questionable whether or not the policies in place that are designed to prevent this bad activity in the first place are sufficient enough to address the problem. We still see a lot of challenges around hate speech, harassment online, and spreading exponentially as well. Brittan highlighted that harassment is really the vocabulary of these authoritarian regimes, and I really think that's a great way of putting it, because the policies that the platforms have in place, they're just not sufficient to deal with the targeting of women, of political dissidents, of minority groups, or of other vulnerable populations online who are constantly facing the bombardment of this kind of speech in these open spaces. The third thing that's new about computational propaganda has to do with data and the data behind a lot of these campaigns. We live in a networked economy where data is the currency. It underlies every activity online, and it's really hard to exist in contemporary modern society without being tracked or without being surveilled, without having every activity that we're doing online or even in the offline world being recorded somewhere by someone through our technology. This is really important when we're thinking about the digital authoritarian toolbox, because this massive commercial surveillance infrastructure that is being built up can also be used to target dissidents, to identify particular groups of people, to target them with propaganda, with other kinds of disinformation that already appeals to them based on who they are and what they believe. It provides a medium for confirmation bias to be exploited and then to further polarize people around really contentious political issues. These are the challenges that we're thinking about today when we're thinking about computational propaganda. But technology is constantly innovating. We're constantly seeing new techniques, new ways of breaking the system. For example, what happens when AI-powered chatbots make it so much harder for real people to distinguish between genuine accounts and fake accounts? We're already starting to see deepfakes and media manipulation ramp up in the lead up to elections, but just generally on social media in order to distort truth and fact. What happens when our technical systems can no longer detect when a video has been altered, or if it's been shifted or misrepresented in some kind of way? What happens when people are constantly bombarded with images that may or may not be true, that it becomes almost impossible to get to the bottom of the facts? And the third thing, the Internet of Things. When these cyber-physical systems come into our homes, come into our workplaces, our vehicles, even on our bodies through wearables, clothing, implants, the vast amount of data that is going to be collected on scale is going to increase exponentially over the next 5 years. We can already determine someone's most intimate details about themselves, including things like their sexual orientation, based on just a couple of Facebook likes. What does targeting look like in an age when we have the internet of everything? I think these trends around the tools of technology and the tools of digital authoritarianism fit into this broader theme that the internet is really a realm of power and of contestation. And a lot of authoritarian actors are learning to leverage, to exploit these technologies for their own political game. They're learning how to break technologies and how to game these systems, and essentially how to hack our democracies. Technology is not neutral. It's not a neutral medium where all of these politics are playing out. In fact, the way that we design, imagine, think about, and govern these systems, they have direct implications for human rights, for freedom, and for democracy. And the power rivalries that we're seeing being played out in cyberspace, they also have implications for our freedom, our democracies, and also what even counts as truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. John Scott.
Thanks. I love your point about regimes learning. So, by the way, if you're wondering if it's strange to sort of be on a slowly rotating chair with most of the people behind you, for the record, it is. So, I'm at Citizen Lab, and we work on the digital targeting of civil society, and what we mean by that is like hacking and attempts to compromise sort of personal information. And the way that I kind of come at this problem is that civil society has massively connected, reducing like historic asymmetries, for example, in access to communication. How awesome. But the historic asymmetries of risk between civil society groups and their governments haven't changed fundamentally. And we're sort of seeing the other shoe dropping, namely states wanting to know the private business of people who they see as like their political threats are trying to hack them. So if you were to take like the portfolio of like a regime hacking group, like a Russian regime hacking group, and put it in a pie chart, what you would see is like a third of their targets are not other governments, they're not the military contractors of some Western power, they're actually people in civil society, journalists, etc. Okay, fine, right? No big surprise here, this is intuitive. The problem is, if you're in government or if you're in industry, then you have something you can kind of do about this problem from a technological standpoint, right? You can at least throw money at it, right? Buoying the sort of goofy cybersecurity industry. The problem is, if you're in civil society, you don't have that. What you have is kind of like a not even satisfying set of tools and resources to try to solve your problem. And the results are totally predictable. Namely, civil society groups are getting hacked left and right. Trust is eroding. Paranoia is growing. A lot of the gains that those groups were able to make in the early days of sort of exciting technology and communication, I think are being walked back. So the problem set is, what do we do, right? Well, by volume, where is this bad stuff that I'm talking about happening? And the answer is, increasingly, a lot of it is happening on big, popular platforms that were designed for people to connect, right? The new intercessors of society. But what they weren't designed for was high-risk users. The problem is, as they've slipped their way into what we consider sort of like the intuitive polis, they've attracted that kind of high-risk stuff. And what we see is, by volume, really simple things used to target these groups. So you might say like, wow, you know, if it's a government hacking group, they're going to use something sophisticated. Yes, they will, if their target is sophisticated. But if their target is unsophisticated, they'll fish. They'll do the most basic bargain basement stuff. I think of it like Neapolitan ice cream, right? If you're like a well-developed society with a deep math and science background, then you've got your own highly sophisticated hackers. If you don't have that, but you've got a lot of, say, oil money, then you can buy somebody else's highly sophisticated hackers to do your business. And if you don't have either of those things because you're struggling with sanctions, then it's sort of like the my cousin knows computers approach to hacking. The problem is all of those routes still lead to dissidents, webcams. And so there's this interesting problem set, which is, as researchers, we're faced with these platforms that are not really designed for these high-risk users. The platforms are mostly trying to address the security challenges of large user bases, although they're sympathetic to these high-risk users. And we're seeing problems wherever we scratch, whether it's sort of a global market in companies that are developing surveillance and hacking technology that they're selling, or it's, you know, sort of like roguish states hacking dissidents overseas. And so the problem set is like, how do you deal with this? Well, the traditional tools that people think of when they think of cybersecurity, many of them are very linked to a particular place, a particular set of laws. But the problem is a lot of these threats come without, and a lot of diasporas, for example, are located in other countries. There's this other problem set. So we're talking about sort of the digital authoritarian toolbox. Fine. One of the things that we find as researchers is that when states, even loose-jointed democracies that lack a certain kind of quality oversight of their intelligence and security services, get sophisticated technology for hacking, they abuse it too, right? So it's not just the authoritarians that are doing the bad stuff. So they're kind of a different series of approaches. You have like international norms, right, trying to limit the market of companies that are selling spyware. You've got criminal indictments of, you know, hackers from overseas, and a lot of good that will really do. Platforms have opportunities to address the problem. The issue is the threats are not often that sophisticated, but they work, which makes them kind of like a public health problem. This is often malaria rather than Ebola. And platforms have the challenge that a lot of the things that you would want to do to educate users and make them more secure can also degrade user experience. And so they see this as kind of a reluctant trade-off. So I'm a researcher. I work with an awesome team of researchers at the Citizen Lab. What can we do? Well, we can identify this stuff. We can make it public. And we see certain kinds of positive things. But I'm going to leave you with kind of an interesting, provocative challenge that maybe we can talk about more in conversation, which is increasingly, platforms are taking steps to protect their users from some of these simple attacks. Great, right? Only the problem is, as researchers, we want to know what those attacks are. We want to be able to create accountability. We want to do some attribution. Increasing, though, as platforms are doing this kind of blocking, fewer things are available to us as researchers using things that we can get from targets and victims. Sounds like the disinformation problem space, right? And the problem then is that you, as a researcher, risk becoming a bit of a supplicant to companies who are sitting on interesting data that you really want and who always hold a little bit more of the power because they have the power to sort of provide this data or not. So where I think we're sitting right now is that companies that run big platforms have noticed the problem and are taking steps to address it. We, as researchers, feel that this is like a critical threat to democracy, but we're really limited in a lot of the tools that we have. And increasingly, we're stuck trying to ask companies to provide us with stuff, but they have a lot of experience being burned when they talk about bad things happening to users. So we struggle. Here's where we are.
Absolutely. We're going to open it up now for a 10-minute or so Q&A. So please raise your hands if you have questions for our speakers. We'll be taking questions as well from the app that will be appearing on the screen. So questions from the audience. I'll swivel my chair. Please raise your hand. We'll answer some from the board first. How can hate speech be compatible with the concept of freedom of speech? Surely the two notions are incompatible. Anybody want to take a swing at that?
All right, I think that's mine. When you look at hate speech under international law, there's actually two different types of treatment. One is a positive obligations by states to do something about it. And that's more of the framework that you see in European countries. Second is an obligation also based in freedom. It's a positive obligation versus a negative right. So are you protecting citizens from freedom of, from hate speech, or are you allowing the marketplace of ideas to try to basically eke out the truth from the debate of these ideas? There's not one way or the other that is more effective in combating hate speech. And if you look at the fundamentals of these regimes, they can actually work together, but it does provide a challenge when you're looking at ways that law can address this.
Yep. We have a question for John on the screen. Can you shed some light on the roles of private companies like NSO play in the field of aiding authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, so I feel like after Snowden, the following thing happened. A bunch of governments were like, man, why don't we have that stuff? This stuff looks amazing, right? And the result is an industry has grown to provide that stuff. And there are companies, often staffed by the people who've come out of sort of technically sophisticated intelligence services and signal intelligence communities, who are like, you know what, we'll sell this stuff, and we'll call it lawful interception spyware. And the justification is terrorists use it, right? Criminals use it. So if we give some kind of a piece of, use the internet, so if we give some kind of a piece of hacking technology to governments, they'll solve their problem, which right now is like increasing amounts of data are encrypted and hard to access and happening on, the spies in our pockets, which are mobile phones. The problem is, for the most part, many states can't be trusted with this stuff. And we know this empirically because me and my colleagues as researchers, namely Bill Marzak, who co-does a lot of this research with me, have shown again and again that when you drop a piece of sophisticated malware, hidden surveillance, into a state with bad oversight, they'll abuse it. Big surprise, right? Like, there's no really interesting new thing here. The problem is, and this is kind of interesting, right now, a bunch of the companies that are selling this stuff are trying to get legitimacy because they want to grow. And they're trying to enter the market. They're being acquired by private equity firms, and they're making an absolute pack of money. So there's an interesting opportunity right now to deal with the norms around that and to push on this and to say, look, right now, this technology, for the most part, is probably eroding security as much as it's helping it. And lest you think that this is an academic problem, me and some of my colleagues were targeted by a group of private spies and chased around New York and Toronto and tricked into going to meetings with a group of spies who were trying to figure out what we were doing to research NSO group. It failed. We Chris Hansen'd them and brought cameras. But part of why that happened is that the money is large, and as a result, we're seeing the proliferation of these technologies.
Thank you. How would you feel have you seen any public outcry in China regarding its social ranking surveillance? If not, is there a point in the future when the Chinese government will have to grapple with the consequences of the program? Samantha, do you feel that?
Yeah, I could take that one. I think there's been a little bit of public outcry around the social credit system. We've seen it, especially in academic circles, a lot of criticism about China's surveillance infrastructure and this massive data collection and aggregation and analysis system, essentially, that they're building. In terms of if there's a point in the future where the government is going to have to grapple with some of these decisions. I mean, I think we're starting to see it around the debates with 5G right now and the contract bids that Huawei is trying to make in other Western countries. There's a lot of fear around their infrastructure as feeding into this massive data system. And so I think these debates are definitely coming to light more and more and coming into the public view.
Yeah. Do we have a question from the audience here in person? Any hands? Great. Can we come here? Got a mic? Okay, great.
Hi. I have a question about China and how afraid or not we should be about their use of Western data, particularly tied to services that they provide. For example, bikes in Berlin, where it was proven that they were using up all of the data to create profiles and track people and so on. So how realistic is this as a fear that we should have derived from services?
Does one of you want to take that?
Doesn't matter.
I mean, here's an observation, right? Every big state wants to know as much as they can. And right now, we're all emitting just boatloads of digital exhaust. And it's absolutely the case that if, like a couple years ago, right, there was sort of like the bad stuff that states do and then the concerns about companies and privacy, now those two things have largely collapsed. And I think concerns about China relate to that. You could say there are concerns about almost every state in terms of what it does to gain access to data and services. And I think the paranoia around 5G and who's building out the infrastructure comes from a national security place and a sense, which is accurate, that the internet has totally balkanized, right? And each state looks at the domains that it controls and then sees if another state has sort of something inside their domain as a threat and a threat to their sovereignty.
The thing that I wonder about is how much information are we giving away for free? So one of the things that I'm fascinated with, and there hasn't been a lot of research on yet, is the role of platforms that are coming from China that are targeting youth populations and other minority groups, like TikTok, which is promoting itself kind of as a sanitized, cleaned up version of Vine for those who miss the ability to share really cute 15-second videos with everyone. I think a lot of people don't realize that that is a Chinese application and is gathering and then potentially a large amount of data about young foreign audiences. China also purchased a dating app that's being used by LGBT populations. So that's the sort of thing that I think about. What is the intersection of data sets that foreign actors may have access to, and what is that going to look like in the future?
It's like if I could just add one,
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's like the fears about foreign governments having access to this data, in some ways they're like canaries. We should be worried about this always, right? Because what that shows is the power in that data. Like what freaks me out is the thought that in not too long, all of the people running for office will have lives that are entirely known by large platforms. Holy crow, right? Like somebody goes into a meeting with a powerful platform as a politician, and they don't know what that platform even knows about them. To me, that's spooky.
We have a question over there.
Hi, I have two questions. One is, what can civil society and journalists, especially in countries in Asia where governments are looking at China and saying, hey, this is great, this is how we're going to keep people in line. So what can civil society and journalists do, the steps that we can take to prevent us from going down that road and safeguard our democracies? My second question is, should platforms be held liable because in some way they're also approaching governments? Take Google, for example, it's thinking of Dragonfly and re-entering China and sort of making concessions into demands. And even platforms like Facebook, where they go to political parties and say, we'll increase your engagement, and then later on they cry about their platform being hijacked. But shouldn't there be some sort of a wall that prevents them from either offering their services to the government in terms of reaching a larger base?
We might just have time for one of those questions. So. Samantha?
Yeah, sure. So I think I could probably answer the second one better than the first. And whenever I'm thinking about, let me try and answer them together, because whenever I'm thinking about solutions to these problems, it's really a multidimensional approach that needs to be taken. Putting the onus on journalists and civil societies organizations to deal with the problem on their own to try and protect against a lot of the harms, I don't think that's fair or necessarily right when there are a lot of systemic challenges that serve to amplify hate speech, amplify targeted harassment, amplify a lot of these campaigns that they experience in the first place. So yes, civil society can take a lot of steps, and I'm sure John could speak to some of that a little bit more, but I think responsibility also does come down to platform, and it does come down to governments to hold platforms accountable when things don't work right and when they are exploited or misused in ways that cause a lot of real harm to real people. Exactly what that looks like, that's the million-dollar question, I think, that we're all trying to answer when we think about the challenges at the intersection of social media and democracy, because it's not straightforward. There isn't a silver button solution. We're constantly making trade-offs between freedom of speech and harassment. We're making trade-offs between anonymity and harmful speech online as well, right? There are different things that we're constantly trying to balance and strike. Essentially just strike balance. It's not a straightforward answer.
Sure. Just one last question, one sentence answer that was on the board just a minute ago for each of you. Is the internet a tool for liberation or repression? Easy question. Yeah.
Super easy. So your question about China, I feel like China is the counterexample to optimism. And what China is showing a lot of states is, hey, look, you don't need to be afraid of technology. You can do a lot of your stuff with it, right? And I think that a lot of other states are looking at the Chinese example and learning that there's nothing in the logic of technology that's inherently liberating. It can be a tool of power and control just as easily as it can be a tool for change.
That goes along with what I was going to say, where technology is not inherently good or inherently evil. Technology is a tool.
Yeah, for me, I think the internet is what we want it to be, honestly. I think we've talked a lot about the negative consequences of technology recently, especially when we're thinking about disinformation and propaganda. But I always like to remind myself of all the good that the internet does as well. I was just saying the other day, there isn't a day that goes by where I don't see something funny on the internet that makes me smile, right? And that's a beautiful thing. The amount of information that we now have access to, the ability to connect with so many people, to share humor, laughter, happiness with one another, that's great. It gives so many people opportunities to contribute to the global economy, to better their lives. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that, especially when we're thinking about combating some of the harms that we've recently seen.
Thank you. I hope that's given you all a lot to think about. Thank you, Samantha, Brittan, and John Scott. And that wraps up our talk. Thank you.
Thanks for moderating.